Okay. So welcome to 2021's version of I Promised That I Was Not Ignoring You. This is a session about hearing loss, all different grades. And we're going to talk a little bit about, or I'm going to talk a little bit about different levels of hearing loss, how hearing loss impacts daily living, etc. All right. So first thing first, this course does address social work ethics. So please keep in mind the morals and values that may arise through the presentation. And we will talk about ethics at the end of the session and how we can apply them to our practice. Also, there are some simulations. I'm encouraging you to please participate because they can be fun. So please grab a pen and some paper so you can get the most from this experience. One thing that I believe is very important to emphasize is that although I am someone with hearing loss that is aided by hearing aids, I do not know everything about hearing loss. I do not know what anybody experiences related to their hearing loss other than myself. So there, in no way, shape, or form can I call myself the expert. And as the slide says, you will soon see what I mean by this. Also, this presentation is given in a couple of different perspectives, and you will soon see what I mean by that. But I want you to make note of the fact that you will find information from several different sources that may actually provide you with some conflicting information. So there's the disclaimer. This is further information about how the presentation is divided into two parts. One being the hearing loss in the hearing world, which you will see more information about that, as that is what I have more experience in. And number two, being deaf and living in the deaf community. It's really, really important to identify these two distinctions, because if we want to truly honor people who have hearing loss and people who are deaf, then we need to recognize that some live in the hearing world and some aren't capable of living in the hearing world or aren't able to integrate with the hearing world. So this is another reason why I have decided to put more information about living in the hearing world with hearing loss, because as you can tell, 3% of the population in the US is deaf and uses primarily sign language. Everybody else, as you can tell, does some sort of integration with the rest of the hearing world. So we've got 3% who basically only communicate with sign language or written language or something of that nature. Everybody else does what they can to integrate into the hearing world. And if you're curious about me, I fall somewhere right here, in between moderate and severe. Okay. More about me, because I know everybody's really excited about that. And I also did some research and found out that storytelling is one way to really captivate an audience and get you guys interested in what we have to talk about. So I am especially passionate about this topic because being at the risk of disclosing my age, being almost 40, and having a diagnosis since I was a young toddler, about 3.5. I have been living with a significant hearing loss and trying to figure out how to navigate this world. So I requested to start learning sign language when I was in 5th grade, and Kanawha County Education System provided me with a special teacher who helped me learn how to sign, and they also sent special teachers to help me with learning language skills. I also, like you'll see later in the presentation, was the recipient of several ongoing traumas that were relatively difficult. And so they also are a part of my being and contribute to my desire to want to be a helper. And so when I became a teenager, I realized that there was a whole world of suffering out there, and a whole bunch of people who were turning their heads and not paying attention to the suffering, and basically denying the fact that the suffering existed. So I decided at that point that I wanted to do something to change that. So that's a little bit about why I became a social worker. And I also need to speak to what happened to me personally when the pandemic transpired. When it was announced that we would no longer be able to communicate maskless and we needed to socially isolate and socially distance, that concept and the fact that I read lips or speech read, combined with my history of trauma, sent me into complete and utter terror. I actually had to take some time off of work and try to regain my grounding because I was in fear of my life. As you can imagine, living in a world where people do not understand that you can't even hear footsteps or traffic or anything. And knowing that I would have to explain myself to every single person I came in contact with was extremely daunting. So that adds to the reason why I needed to develop this presentation and share with more people about the impact of living in this world with hearing loss. Okay, so now the more important part is, why does it matter to you? The reason it matters is because it doesn't affect just the person who has the hearing loss. Everyone around us gets to experience the hearing loss with us. 466 million are estimated to have hearing loss, according to the WHO. Out of the 36 to 40 million American people with some form of hearing loss, only 35% are 65 and older. It is estimated that 3 infants out of 1,000 are born with hearing loss. And the most significant one that I want to share with you is that it is found that 40% of parents of deaf children will learn sign language. So that means 40% of these deaf children have access to any kind of communication skills that would be sufficient to express their needs. More about why does this matter? Only 1 out of every 5 people who could benefit from wearing hearing aids actually wears one. There's a lot of shame associated with hearing loss and hearing aids. Also, there are many causes for hearing loss. They include birth defects, hereditary factors, injuries to the ear or head, infections, ototoxic reactions to medications or treatment, excessive noise exposure, and more. It is estimated that 30 million Americans are exposed to dangerous levels of noise every single day, with 10 million Americans who already suffer irreversible noise-induced hearing loss. Here are some more statistics about hearing loss and age ranges and by severity. Hearing aids are underutilized despite the fact that their use is shown to improve the social and functional and emotional effects of hearing loss. You may want to take note of the providers of the information that I'm sharing with you. This will lead us a little bit towards what happens later in the presentation. It is estimated that 1 in 4 adults aged 20 years and older who could benefit from hearing aids has actually used them. 1 in 3 age 70 plus are going to use a hearing aid, and about 1 in 6 from ages 20 to 69. Here's a fairly comprehensive list of why people don't wear hearing aids. And as you can see, a lot of it has attachment to shame. More statistics, we'll note down here, the number of people who experience hearing loss is more than those with Parkinson's, epilepsy, Alzheimer's, and diabetes combined. Adult men are twice as likely as women to experience hearing loss, but women are twice as likely as men to disclose their hearing loss and to offer helpful communication strategies. Ha, hence me. Okay. How do we know that someone might have a hearing loss? Complaints of muffled hearing, reduced ability to distinguish certain words in speech, like trying to distinguish between the words sat, bat, hat, bat. Need for greater volume when listening to the radio or television, and social withdrawal as a result of frustration with hearing in noisier social settings. Adapting to or with hearing loss. Many people who experience hearing loss develop coping mechanisms to manage hearing loss by using behaviors such as lip or speech reading. They may cup their hand behind their ear. They may sit on a certain side of another person during a conversation to hear better. My right ear is much better than my left, so I prefer for people to be on my right side. They also may choose to sit in a quiet area of the restaurant or in the front of the classroom, front of the audience. In the latter stages of hearing loss, these tools no longer become effective or require too much effort to continue. I found a quote that I really liked. Isolation is common when you can't comfortably communicate. You retreat into yourself where it's safe in the silence. You get gun shy going out into the world, worried that your dark secret will come up, as if you've committed a crime. None of it is true, of course. So this is the first link. This is not one of the interactive ones. This is just more informational about the different types of hearing loss. There's conductive hearing loss, which is caused by basically something in the ear, whether it's the outer part of the ear or the middle ear. Sensory neural is the most common, and it's caused by damage to the inner ear. It reduces the amount of sound waves that are sent to the brain. There's also a combination of the former two, conductive and sensory neural. And then there's a newer one that is being studied more, where they're finding that information is processed by the inner ear, but the transmission of signals to the brain doesn't seem to be working accurately. So that's one that's still more, like I said, emerging. So we're looking for more information to come on that. For the meantime, we'll watch this video about more about the types of hearing loss.
Ears are constantly active. They pick up sound waves and change them into information that the brain can interpret, such as music or speech. Sound is a pressure wave that can vibrate either quickly or slowly. Slow vibrations produce deep sounds, while quick vibrations produce high-pitched sounds. Sound enters the ear and is directed through the ear canal, where it first reaches the eardrum. As the eardrum begins to vibrate, it sets the ossicular chain in motion. The ossicular chain consists of the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup. Sound vibrations move along the ossicular chain and into the inner ear. Within the inner ear, the cochlea plays a central role. It is here that the mechanical energy of sound is converted into complex electrical signals, which are then passed on to the brain. In simplified terms, the cochlea is a spiral-shaped tube filled with fluid. Sensory cells, also called hair cells, line the entire length of the cochlea. These hair cells have varying degrees of sensitivity for the detection of different tones or frequencies. This allows the ear to perceive the entire spectrum of sound. The change from mechanical vibration to electrical pulse is a complex process resulting from the movement of hair cells in the cochlea. Along the entire length of the cochlea, the hair cells are arranged like the keys of a piano. Hair cells located at the base or lower region of the cochlea are responsible for high frequency, while hair cells at the apex are responsible for the low frequencies. As the fluid in the cochlea is set in motion, it causes a corresponding movement of the fine structures on the surface of the hair cells to take place. These movements cause tension differences, which produce electrical signals that are passed along the hearing nerve to the brain. The auditory cortex of the brain interprets this information as sound, for example, as music or speech. The entire chain of events, including the various steps that convert sound waves from the environment into information that the brain can interpret, happens so fast that individuals can hear sound both continuously and instantaneously. Within this complex chain of events, there are a number of factors which can cause an individual to experience hearing loss. A loss of hearing can range from a mild to moderate hearing deficiency to a total hearing loss. In general, there are three main types of hearing loss which differ from one another depending on the part of the ear that is affected, be it the outer, middle, or inner ear.
Well, okay. The most frequent causes of hearing loss are noted here, and as I noted before. So the next important topic is what happens when we do not treat hearing loss. It is found that there are links between hearing loss and accelerating conditions such as Alzheimer's, depression, and deprived brain function. A study conducted at Washington's Department of Medicine of 100 cases of Alzheimer's patients found that 83% had hearing loss. Once they were fit with hearing aids, 35% were classified with a less severe form of dementia. Other conditions linked to untreated hearing loss include falls, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, rheumatoid arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, and kidney disease. As the brain receives less sound, it forgets what to do with the sound. So therefore, it doesn't have as much training. In 1999, the National Council on Aging published a unique large-scale study on the found that individuals with hearing loss who did not use hearing aids were almost twice as likely to experience depression as those who were treating their hearing loss. This study also supports the use of hearing instruments to reduce the likelihood of depression, anxiety, or paranoia. And 20% of people with untreated hearing loss experienced symptoms of depression, at least three key symptoms. If we treat the hearing loss, then these effects can be more avoidable. More consequences of hearing loss: communication difficulties, embarrassment, lack of concentration, depression, avoidance of social activities, danger to personal safety, social rejection, reduced job performance, diminished psychological and overall health. More information on the psychological effects can cause lack of concentration, worry, insecurity, embarrassment, adjustment problems. So here's a illustration that recommends that we have our teeth and eyes checked regularly, but what about our ears? Everyone over the age of 55 should have their hearing checked as part of an overall wellness program. Think about all you gain when you have your hearing checked. I guess we can take a second to see if there's any questions so far.
So one of the questions that was asked is, where can people go to get financial assistance in paying for hearing aids? Medicare and a lot of other insurances don't provide coverage for this issue.
Absolutely. There is a list that I have been given by someone that I can try to obtain and pass along. But most of all, Quota Club, QUOTA, Quota Club, they are an international society that does fundraisers to raise money for the cost of hearing devices, refurbished hearing devices. Lions Club, Starkey Foundation has low income or adjusted income programs. And so you're going to find that most of your audiologists have access to these programs. It's just important to get connected with a good one. Anything else?
I had a comment on that. This is Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if they still do or not. Maybe somebody out there that works with vocational rehabilitation can speak on this, but I know Voc Rehab used to pay for hearing aids if it was necessary for employment for an individual, or if it was necessary for an employee to keep their job. So if you're working at a job and you're afraid you're going to lose your job because you're losing your hearing, you can become a Voc Rehab client and get that paid for by Voc Rehab so that you can keep your job.
They did, excuse me, they did do it a few years ago, but I think when I left rehab, when I retired rehab, they had stopped doing that. However, they may have already picked it up again. I'm not sure. When I left, they had stopped.
I think it depends on what levels they're on. Sorry, my dog's barking. I think it depends on what levels they're currently serving. I know they have tiers, and
It
so
is, it does. It does depend on all that, but most of that, I think, most of that is for uh, kids that have disabilities that are attending some type of school. But if they do accept your application, they will put you on a waiting list more than likely.
Live in Mercer County, and I just received hearing aids through VOCA
Good. Go.
rehab, so they are still doing it.
Are they still doing it?
Mercer
Okay.
County.
I actually have received a pair of hearing aids through Voc Rehab.
Mhm.
I think my income was a little bit too high, but where I had some medical issues at the same time, the output of money that was going towards the medical bills was able to offset whatever my income was. So it's worth giving it a shot for any of you who find that hearing loss is impacting your life and you would like to stay gainfully employed. Check out your local vocational rehab and check with the counselors there to see if you might qualify. Any others? Okay. It's important to emphasize that hearing loss is more complicated than just the absence of sound. There's many ranges of hearing loss, from mild to moderate to severe to profound. And simply providing volume or amplification does not equal clarity. So one example I used to use in the nursing homes when I was working at nursing homes was if I were to start screaming at you to ask you if you need to use the bathroom, do you need to use the bathroom? It doesn't sound any clearer than if I were to say, do you need to use the restroom? It's important to note that the majority of health insurances do not cover assistive hearing devices or the batteries that sustain them. They also need to be replaced every 5 to 7 years, which is the typical max lifespan of a hearing aid. And many hearing aid batteries need to be replaced every 4 to 8 days for each hearing aid. Some of you were here early and heard me comment on wearing hearing aids 24/7, at least one 24/7. And so my batteries last anywhere from 3 to 4 days because I use them 24/7. According to a hearing aid or a hearing tracker done by the Hearing Loss Association of America, a survey of roughly 2,000 persons revealed that 1 out of every 4 persons actually has help with paying for their hearing aids. 1 in 20 actually had full coverage from their insurance company. 22 states mandate insurance coverage for hearing aids for children only. Only 5 states mandate coverage for hearing aids for children and adults: Arkansas, Connecticut, Illinois, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Note West Virginia is not on there. So there's many grades of hearing loss and measurements of the severity of hearing loss, and that's what we're moving into now. We go anywhere from slight to and mild hearing loss to moderate to severe to profound. What you'll see is a little bit, it's kind of blurry, so it's difficult to read. I have some more charts that you guys will be able to look at. But as I mentioned before, my hearing loss falls in the moderate to severe grade. And I hear about 60% at 90 decibels, which these areas are measured in decibels. So with that being said, at 90 decibels, I hear about 60% of sound at the volume of drilling concrete without my hearing aids. Some of you may note that my speech is relatively clear. I might be somewhat articulate. I was designed that way, and I worked very, very hard for many, many years to get to where I am today. A lot of other people don't have the same circumstances that I did, and so typically you would find somebody with my severity of hearing loss not being in the same kind of position as I am. Another chart to illustrate the levels of decibel noise and how they're measured. Okay. Here is one of my favorite parts, and this is where we start working on the simulations or experiencing the simulations. First one is the Flintstones. Some of us are big fans, so hopefully you'll appreciate this.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Aha! You're on my apartment building on Granite Avenue. You owe me $300. Get it up?
Take it easy. It's only a game.
Well, but I'm just like them big tycoons. I play to win. Now, Barney, pay up or get out of the game. Aha! You're on my apartment building on Granite Avenue. You owe me $300. Get it up?
Take it easy. It's only a game.
Well, just like them big tycoons.
Did you guys notice the different distinctions between the levels of hearing loss? Mild, moderate, severe. Did you notice that with the more severe the hearing loss was, that it also became more fuzzy and difficult to distinguish different sounds? I'm not going to play the normal hearing one on this because I think we all know, but I will click on the next link.
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing
Oh, I'm sorry.
sounds. Loud noise causes permanent hearing loss. A high-frequency hearing loss makes it difficult to understand conversation. A hearing test or audiogram helps find any unusual changes in your hearing. Off-the-job noise is just as dangerous as noise on the job.
I've actually changed my mind. I am going to do the normal hearing for the sake
You
of
can prevent hearing loss by
distinguishing
keeping
the
away
difference.
from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing protection whenever you're around loud sounds. Loud noise causes permanent hearing loss. A high-frequency hearing loss makes it difficult.
So we'll go back to the moderate hearing loss.
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise.
We can't see the videos. I think there's something you have to do to exit out of the PowerPoint or something.
Can you hear them because there aren't videos?
Oh, okay.
Hearing loss makes it difficult to understand conversation. A hearing test or audiogram helps find any unusual changes.
Okay, this is normal hearing with background noise.
You can prevent hearing loss by keeping away from loud noise. Wear earmuffs, earplugs, or other hearing protection whenever you're around loud sounds.
As you can tell, these are the same, basically the same statements made by the same guy, with the different differentiations with hearing loss and background noise. So this is moderate hearing loss with background noise. Okay. So hopefully those examples were ways that help you see just the specific ways that hearing loss can impact how someone communicates. The last but not least, this one's the most fun, is the unfair hearing test. This is where you need some paper and a pen, because we're going to do a hearing test with the idea that you have some hearing loss. So I do urge you not to turn up your sound. Keep it at your normal level, because this will really give you the simulation of living with hearing loss. I'm gonna try it one more time. Oh no, I guess that link doesn't work anymore. I'm gonna look.
It looks like it's trying.
I think this might be the same one.
Word number one. Word number one. Word number two. Word number two. Word number three. Word number three. Word number four. Word number four. Word number five. Word number five. Word number six. Word number six. Word number seven. Word number seven. Word number eight. Word number eight. Word number nine. Word number nine. Word number 10. Word number 10.
I'm honestly not sure how they expect you to.
Word number one. Number one.
Ah, this is it.
Number two. Pass. Number three. Sun. Number four. Heat. Number five. Wise. Number one. Fill. Number two. Catch. Number three. Thumb. Number four. Heap.
Just for hoofing it out here, I mean.
Number five. Wise.
It'd be different if they fill their cups twice. You know what I mean?
Your hearing is a complex system of delicate and interconnected parts that's easy to take for granted. To help you better understand why hearing
Okay. Was anybody able to distinguish what those 5 words were during the first example? Did anybody have difficulty figuring out the words?
I've got 3 words.
All right.
I think I did. I got catch, thumb, and heap.
Okay. So the first 5, since we didn't get to do the full video like I wanted, were fill. Number 2 was catch. Number 3 was thumb. Number 4 was heap. And number 5 was wise.
I got 3 of the 5. But then
fairly
some of the other ones,
consistent.
I was like way off. It was like, what?
If you want to continue doing some simulations, you can type in unfair hearing test and obviously get the experience of what it's like to hear from different, as you could tell, like with a high frequency loss or aided by a hearing aid, because it's kind of fun to do if you like that kind of thing.
Sarah, did you find though that, I mean, it makes sense now that since there's so much undetected hearing loss, especially among children, like if you had done that as spelling words, just the words, but do you find that if there's a context, like if, you know, the word is, you know, catch, for example, but you could have thought it was a lot of things just hearing the word, but if you would do a sentence like, I will catch the ball, the context may help the hearing impaired person?
For sure. And actually, that's exactly what we're getting ready to move into. That's actually why I actually communicate as well as I do, because I spend a lot of time deciphering and moving through conversations by doing it much more slowly in my head than what typically people speak. So as you notice here, a person with hearing loss may experience the inability to hear all words in sequence, meaning we may hear 1 out of every 3 words. Sometimes we have to assume the words that we do not hear. This can cause some pretty funny mistakes. I've got a personal story about that. And in fact, at the very beginning of this seminar, Joe Deegan was asking Faith if she would keep track of the questions. And I spoke up because I thought he was talking to me. And so that led to a couple of laughs. But another example is when I was in college and sitting in the dormitory with probably 5 or 6 other girls, we were having conversation, or so I thought, conversation about Tae Bo. And at that time, it was, the late 90s, early 2000s. Tae Bo was really hot. And I was so excited because I had been working out with Tae Bo for quite some time. And I was able to maintain my weight and I was pretty excited about it. So when I heard people talking about Tae Bo, I jumped right in. Woohoo, Tae Bo, I love Tae Bo. I work out with Tae Bo every single day. And the room fell silent. They were like, Sarah, we were talking about the top bunk of a bunk bed. So needless to say, I was a little bit embarrassed. Thankfully, I sometimes have a good sense of humor, so I'm able to laugh at myself, but sometimes it's not quite as funny and embarrassing. So more things to note are hearing aids and cochlear implants do not restore hearing to normal. It's not equivalent to glasses correcting eyesight. Hearing aids will increase the volume, but only slightly enhance the clarity by raising the volume in certain frequencies. So with that being said, this kind of goes back to the simulations that allow you to recognize that with the more progressive hearing loss or the more hearing loss someone has, the less clear it sounds. And the other reason why yelling does not help. Background noise is given the same precedence as a speaker's voice. And so it can be very difficult to figure out where the sound is coming from. A cochlear implant, it can be helpful for some people, but for some people, it only will give an awareness of the sounds around without understanding what those sounds mean or what they are. An example of this is with each set of hearing aids that I get. Remind you, I get a new set every 5 to 7 years. The technology is better and the sound is different every single time. 2 hearing aid sets ago, I heard an elevator button click for the very first time. I also heard the ceiling fan whirring. And oh my gosh, I don't know how you guys can deal with that. I also heard rock salt under the undercarriage of a car, had no idea what it was. And I also heard a car come from all the way down the street. And I thought, what on earth is that? So these sounds, these new sounds that we pick up, that I pick up, that someone picks up, are difficult to determine until we've rehearsed it and we know what the sound is. But wait, there's more. Just because someone with hearing loss has ears that don't work doesn't mean that the brain doesn't. Just because there's hearing loss, it doesn't mean that we're not able to communicate or become successful. People with hearing loss have the same range of intelligence as the general hearing population. I will never forget working at Dairy Queen while I was in college, and someone very quickly noticed my hearing aids and proceeded to tell me that they needed an ice cream cone dipped in chocolate. And I said, all right. Just because I read lips and can sign does not mean that all people can. Also, it does not mean that it works all the time. If I am not looking at you and paying attention to you specifically, I probably didn't hear you. Not all people communicate the same way. It's important to note that since there are varying degrees of hearing loss, we also need to take into account when someone lost their hearing and the level of auditory training they may have. So if someone has lost their hearing later on in life, they may already know what certain sounds sound like versus someone who lost their hearing as an infant. Sign language has syntax in grammar as well. Each part of the country and each country have their own grammar and can be much different from spoken language. Lip reading is now commonly referred to as speech reading, as there's much more to the concept than just reading lips. It involves reading body language, emotion, and gesturing. So when working on cultivating relationships and awareness with persons who have hearing loss, it's important to take some time to understand the nature of their loss. Hence, maybe ask some questions. Also, how it's impacted their life. The media is the fastest and most cost-effective way to raise awareness and eliminate stereotypes, promote inclusion of individuals with hearing loss, and reduce the perceived stigma that is still ingrained in our society. With that, doing so will help fight the hidden epidemic of hearing loss, which is both highly prevalent and severely undertreated. Each person's story is different. It's important to learn it through their eyes, including the emotional impact, such as shame and embarrassment, isolation, avoidance, etc. Please also be mindful of age. Please do not assume. Ask. This was taken from a brochure that I received maybe when I was in 6th grade. And when I read this, I stopped because for the very first time, I felt like somebody understood me. If you are a hearing person, imagine if someone slams a cupboard door, you jump, startled almost to tears. If you are a hearing person, imagine if you are at a party and the steady hum of people talking grows louder and louder until you feel that you must remove your hearing aid or leave. If you are a hearing person, imagine if after a lengthy conversation, you learn that someone has been telling you about their scoliosis while you've been talking about blue roses. If you are a hearing person, imagine if everyone is listening to someone tell a joke. Suddenly, everyone bursts into laughter except for you because you didn't hear the punchline. You are introduced, or if you are a hearing person, imagine if you are introduced to a pipe-smoking stranger, teacher, business contact, or new boss who has a mustache. Your heart sinks at the thought that you will not understand him or be able to read his lips. If you are a hearing person, imagine if you think you heard your name and someone said something to you, but you were concentrating on something else. You cannot tell where the sound came from. And then the speaker shouts the request again, irritated that you haven't responded, causing you to feel startled, embarrassed, and possibly even physical pain. If you are a hearing person, imagine if you wish that people understood how isolated you felt when these things happened. You wish someone would help. You want to take part in life around you, but the failures are too many, and you decide to stop trying. These events are common for a person with hearing loss, and so often are the feelings of pain, embarrassment, confusion, and isolation. Going out, trying to participate and communicate with others often becomes too exhausting for people who have hearing loss. Ultimately, communication may seem more trouble than it's worth. So, we've learned all about hearing loss. Do we have any more questions that I should address first?
Sarah, this is Helen Snyder. I have a question about how are we accommodating or working with hearing impaired folks during COVID with the mask, the whole mask thing in meetings and everything, when they can't read lips at all. I know we have a consultant that is hearing impaired, and she just is having a really difficult time because she can't do the lip reading.
Simple answer, nobody is. So essentially, persons who cannot hear, literally, people just lower their mask and say what they need to say. That's
yeah, I figured that was the appropriate thing. I mean, to maintain the distance, but still you're going to have to lower your mask to communicate, or they're completely cut off from communication.
Yeah.
Figured that was the appropriate action. Yeah.
I've seen some masks that have a hole cut out with a plastic shield so that people can read lips through them. I don't know where those.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have them and I've given them out, but I've never seen anybody else wear them.
Okay.
So yeah, they exist, and some people wear face shields.
Shields, the clear shields, yeah.
And so that's actually, I'm lying. I have seen some people with clear masks, but the majority of the time, I'm finding that people will either wear a face shield or will lower their mask for me.
Okay.
Good question.
There There are some other questions that people had put in the chat earlier when you had been discussing getting your new hearing aids and hearing new sounds. A couple of those questions are, where can people go to get financial assistance? Oh, sorry, that's the first question. Sorry. Every
Like,
time
that sounds familiar.
I know, I'm like, deja vu. Every time that you hear a different sound, do you struggle to adjust with that? And when you hear a new sound, do you feel that you need to figure out what it is, or is there anything that surprised you?
Well, those are great questions. Thank you for asking. A lot of people would not feel the need to find out what the sounds are. However, I'm a very nosy, very curious, very anxious person. So every single time I hear a new sound that is not familiar, I say, hey, somebody tell me what that was. Tell me what that was. And then I am a little mesmerized for a little while, and then I add stories to my presentation. So, and yes, that happens with every new set of hearing aids. So I have heard new sounds that were indistinguishable every single time. That's why getting a new set of hearing aids is especially stressful for me. And I usually am even more exhausted for at least a couple of weeks after I get a new set and have to adjust.
Another question is, would you consider it to be helpful for social workers to carry a notepad and pen around?
It could be. I mean, that could work for a lot of people.
I know I've found it helpful. Every job I've ever had, I have come into contact with someone who was either deaf or hard of hearing. And that's one thing I did suggest for people who run into those situations, that if they don't have an interpreter on hand, that would actually be something that would be helpful to be able to write it down and communicate that way. So
certainly.
And the last question that was from the chat is, can you recommend a place that treats complicated hearing loss that regular hearing aids won't help?
Wow. I'm guessing we're gonna go with like a cochlear implant for those who want to remain or reintegrate in the hearing world. That is the best option for those who have such advanced hearing loss that they don't benefit from wearing hearing aids. Outside of that, we will get there. That's actually later in the presentation, and I'll share with you my other recommendations. Okay, so moving on. Accommodating hearing loss, please don't yell. Emphasis on please. Okay. Please remove any obstructions to the mouth. Please check room acoustics and lighting. So if the room is too large and the sound is going to bounce off of all of the walls, or we're sitting by a campfire and it is pitch black outside, these are not great places for someone with hearing loss to try to communicate. Please keep awareness that someone with hearing loss must give you full undivided attention in order to really understand communication. Please do not whisper. Don't assume that I heard you just because I looked at you. One really important rule of thumb is to rephrase instead of repeating. So instead of, like my example before, do you need to use the bathroom? Say, okay, do you need to use the toilet? Do we need to go to another room? It's important to try to find different words if the person with hearing loss is not understanding the words that you are trying to use. Please be aware that proximity is important. and that accents can further impair speech reading abilities. All right, just like with any other disability, please use people first language. Hearing loss does not define a person. So we would use examples like person A has hearing loss, person B is hard of hearing, or person C wears hearing aids. The term deaf denotes profound loss of hearing and can also refer to the community of people who are deaf and share a language. Also, it is not too expensive to accommodate us, just ask, and we can be creative in finding ways to make communication easier. For everyone is different. There are some people who are deaf that do not read or write. So it is not safe to assume that all of us can read or write. More ways to accommodate, please do not say never mind. This tactic is, or this phrase often leads someone with hearing loss to feel as if they aren't important enough to be included in the conversation. Be aware that someone may use a tactic of repeating what was heard and ask you to fill in the blanks. Those of us with hearing loss are used to accommodating you. This kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning before we started. And I actually realized in the last couple of weeks that I do wear my hearing aids 24/7, at least one. It never really occurred to me to take my hearing aids out and say, you guys handle this, I'm done. I've never taken my hearing aids out and expected that my loved ones learn how to sign and communicate with me. That's just it. So I am never living in my natural state, which is without hearing aids. Next is something that I receive very often, which is that many people forget that I need accommodations because I do so well acting like I hear. Thanks, but it really doesn't mean anything to me. All many of us have ever wanted was to feel included. Please do your best not to alienate us. Please do not tell me how annoyed you are with having to accommodate me. Parenting presents different challenges, especially when we cannot hear our children. I have a 3-year-old. Some of you heard me talking about that. And I unfortunately was not able to hear her first words, nor we have a lot of difficulty with enunciation and me understanding her. She has learned after I read a book to her about my hearing loss and how it is not her fault that I can't hear her. But for a long time, she got very frustrated with me and would blame me for not being able to hear her. Keep in mind that many of us cannot hear beepers, timers, telephone rings, buzzers, etc., unless we are close enough to hear it and it is loud enough to distract us from whatever we're already doing. So I might hear a microwave, but only if I'm waiting to hear the microwave. Cannot hear traffic, not when I'm walking in it, not when I'm driving in it, not with the windows open or shut. I know it sounds a little Dr. Seussy, but that's it. I cannot hear anybody walking behind me. So if you are not in my periphery and I'm not aware of you being there, I'm assuming that I'm all alone. So needless to say, I'm someone who does not like to be surprised. Last but not least, life is always surrounded by the fact that we do not hear unless we do. So it is assumed that there is silence at all times until there is no silence. In groups and noisy settings, obviously groups are a necessity, but when we're in a group, we miss a lot of what was said. And this is because, reading lips and having to scan the audience to figure out who's talking and then read their lips and then figure out what they're saying. And then the next person talks. And so, as you can imagine, so it's helpful for the presenter so that we have one central location to look instead of trying to figure out where the sounds are coming from. It's helpful for the presenter to repeat the comments and questions that are posed by the audience, one person speak at a time. And when audio is poor, emphasize the visual. In smaller groups, it's great if everyone can face each other, speak one at a time, and obviously make handouts of notes prior to lecture. Okay, now a lot of this was not included in my handout, so if any of you would like a copy of this information or the most recent updated presentation, just let me know. I've included my email at the end of this presentation, and I can shoot it off to you, no problem. So here is my introduction to deaf culture and the differences between hearing loss and being deaf. Coming back to this slide, 3% are deaf and communicate through sign language. The rest accommodate the hearing world. So they speak, they wear hearing aids, they wear cochlear implants, they use other assistive devices, or they don't. And they just have everyone around them repeat themselves. There is a difference between the little d deaf and the big D deaf. The little d refers to a person with deafness. So a person with hearing loss, severe hearing loss, profound hearing loss. The United Nations actually protects the deaf culture. So it is considered, the deaf culture has their own community, and they are not associated with disability and disabled culture. They use capital letters in English. So when you find, I don't know how many of you might be friends with a deaf person on Facebook, but you will find that there many times the language is broken, and many times they use lots of capital letters. Being deaf also, or the deaf culture, meets all the criteria established by social scientists as an ethnic culture of their own. For those of you who know sign, this is the sign for applause or yay. And this was created in the time of Beethoven's day, so that Beethoven knew that people were applauding him and his music. So it is a fact that deaf culture is an identity that must be embraced by the individual. Members of deaf culture choose to view their lack of hearing as a different human experience and not a disability. So this takes us into deaf culture and the difference between how the hearing community views deafness and how deaf culture and people within deaf culture view hearing loss. I wanted to include this just because I thought it was really interesting to see the differences between employment in hearing people and the employment of deaf people. I know a significant number of deaf people and people with hearing loss, and the majority of them are not working or have not worked in a long time. And so it's really interesting to see the significant portion of people who are not in the labor force that are deaf versus the people who have hearing that are not in the labor force. And interestingly enough, the unemployed numbers are virtually the same. All right. So the differences between the little d deaf and the big D deaf is that somebody who's little d deaf, which would be me, did not attend school for the deaf. So I was mainstreamed in the regular classroom. I was taught to be a good little hearing student and raise my hand when I needed to get some extra help, and spent extra time with a special teacher who taught me how to write sentences, and I had a speech therapist that helped me how to learn how to enunciate words. So many people who are big D deaf, part of the deaf culture, actually go to schools that are catered to and provide services for deaf people. So this is going to be places like Gallaudet in Romney, and this is going to be a place where the entire community relies on using sign language, and sounds are not expected. Sounds are not really communicated. People don't really talk, they just sign. So this is where I was going with the idea that if someone's hearing loss is too severe to be impaired by hearing aids or a cochlear implant, then most likely they're going to be shipped off to a community where there are lots of deaf people, so that they have that sense of inclusion. I requested several times to be sent when I was younger, and ultimately decided not to. And for those of you who were wondering, no, my parents never did attempt to learn to sign. So little d deaf, describe hearing loss only in medical terms. So I am deaf, I can't hear you, blah, blah, blah. Big D deaf people consider themselves culturally deaf. Excuse me. Little d deaf people identify with hearing people, and big D deaf people attend schools and programs for the deaf. Little d deaf people do not associate with the deaf community, but big D deaf people are a member of the deaf community. What's really interesting is that in the cultures, there's some differences. So pointing is considered rude in the hearing culture, but in deaf culture, it's perfectly acceptable. In the hearing culture, eye contact is not necessary at all. In deaf culture, you best be giving us some eye contact. What's cool about the deaf culture versus the hearing culture is that we can talk whenever we have food in our mouth, in the middle of other stuff, with a mask on, so we can, we can communicate, without using a mask. The hearing culture usually, short goodbye, which West Virginia is a little bit different. We have the, our version of goodbye. And hearing culture, usually we say, hey, I'm blah, blah, blah. And with deaf culture, you spend more time giving a longer introduction. More differences between little d deaf and big D deaf. The medical perspective is that deaf people can't. They can't do X, Y, Z. They describe sign language as inferior to spoken language. Regard the normal hearing person as the best role model, and they neither accept nor support separate deaf culture. The cultural perspective is that of the big D deaf people believe that deaf people can. They can do everything that a hearing person can. They view sign language as equal to spoken language. They regard successful deaf adults as positive role models for deaf children, and they respect, value, and support language and culture of deaf people. Yeah, excuse me, yes, deaf culture is a thing. Some more of the same. People with the big D deaf in the deaf culture, they prefer ASL or sign languages. There are several different sign languages, lots of different sign languages actually. Whereas most of the people that associate with the little D deaf world prefer terms like hearing impaired, want to become normal, integrate in the hearing world. More nuances, deaf people discuss money, no problem, not taboo at all. Bodily functions, not taboo. I'll never forget the first time I watched someone sign to me that somebody else was fat, and I was like, what? But apparently that's okay. Information is shared. In the hearing world, gossip is rude. In the deaf world, asking personal questions is perfectly acceptable and okay, but in the hearing world, it makes you nosy. Introductions in, Introductions in the deaf world involve who you know, and hearing in the hearing world, it's involved what you do. If you are late and you are deaf and you live in the deaf culture, you explain why you're late. And if you live in the hearing culture, you just do whatever you can to sit in the back of the classroom and not disturb the peace. Deaf people are very clear about criticism, and their remarks show a very caring attitude. The hearing culture uses a sandwich approach. Well, you know, blah, 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 but blah, blah, blah. If you don't have something nice to say. So this is where I believe it might be a good idea to discuss the differences between deaf culture and hearing culture. As you could see earlier, probably, a lot of the information that I shared in the hearing world, hearing loss section of this presentation was provided to you by companies that market hearing aids and companies that market assistive devices and companies that study hearing loss and how to improve hearing loss, how to improve the lives of hearing loss, people who live with hearing loss. When we came to the deaf culture section, we explored the possibility that deafness wasn't a problem, and that is not really an area that needs to be improved or aided. And so that's where the conflict arises, because depending on where you get your information from, well, that comes later, but depending on where you get your information from, it may have some bias. So I want you to keep that in mind. So more stuff to appreciate regarding clinical work with the deaf is that ASL is not English spoken. It is not English spoken in words by hand or signed in words by hands. It is not shorthand for spoken language. It cannot be assumed that any two people with hearing loss have the same language skills. This is very much unlike almost all other languages. So when you go to China and you encounter two people who know the same kind of Chinese language, you can assume that most of them know most of the language or most of the same words. In the deaf culture, you will find that that is not the case. 2/3 of persons with significant hearing deficits were found to have weak or lacking communication skills. So they have limited vocabulary. They're not really able to reference time and sequence. So if they're telling a story, it doesn't really always make sense because there's not necessarily a before, during, and after sequence. unable to establish clear topics, so the information may appear very jumbled. Many have difficulty understanding cause and effect. Many cannot read body language and interpret emotion. So much of the language they speak is not they sign does not actually include feelings and thoughts behind them. Keep in mind that punctuation doesn't exist in sign language, so that also creates the brokenness in the language when it's being interpreted. So how do you interpret for people when there is no native language? I mean, when you think about it, the deaf culture, each pocket of deaf cultures, or each pocket of residents in a particular community are going to have their own language. When you think about the words on fleek or cool, groovy, like that is going to be different everywhere in each deaf community. And so there are a lot of words that are not going to make sense. You cannot rely on your own judgment to determine if you are understood. And I highly suspect and know that the person on the receiving end of what you're trying to tell them, they're not going to tell you if they understood you or not. So the important question to ask is not, do you understand? The important question to ask is, am I clear? And that illustrates the interest in knowing that what you have said is expressed in a way that they might hear. With cross-cultural conflict, people continue to feel oppressed, and persons with hearing loss, people with hearing feel misunderstood. So the concrete thinking that you find in many deaf cultures and people with severe language deprivation makes it very difficult for therapy or social work interventions to be measured. So words like coping, symptom, relapse, recovery, trigger, treatment, therapy, bipolar, they're not really understood in the context as we use them in the hearing world. Like most studies, it is found that most behaviors are often exhibited due to poor language development and communication. So when you think of a 2-year-old that throws themselves in the floor and screams and cries because you did not hear what they had to say, or they did not get what they want, it is very common that when we have difficulty communicating our needs and our desires, that behaviors aren't really going to improve until we find a way to communicate effectively. So it's also found with poor language skills that vocabulary is limited, difficulty finding patterns in behavior. So the concept of, thoughts leading to feelings, leading to behaviors is difficult to understand. Many people are not organized, can't even complete jigsaw puzzles. There's poor attending skills, lack of focus and concentration, poor short-term and long-term memory, difficulty with reading emotion and body language, poor reading, writing, and other academic skills. I want to emphasize there is no scientific evidence of any particular therapy modality being effective with the deaf. There have been no studies. I am reading this book by Neil Glickman. I don't know if you guys can see this. Preparing deaf and hearing persons with language and learning challenges for CBT. Neil Glickman recommends CBT because it introduces structure in a life that otherwise does not often have structure. So solution focus is also helpful in Socratic questioning. This was the answer I got when I looked up scientific studies of therapy modalities effective with the deaf. There was one resource that basically looked at the deaf culture as the glass half empty, glass half full concept. So empty meaning, there's stigma attached to it, recognize that like deaf persons with deafness being recognized as being less than. The glass is full, the overwhelming possibility and potential that the person has, and definitely a minority group to be celebrated. So please keep in mind that when you are accessing or providing resources to others, you may need to recognize the provider of the resource to determine if there may be bias. So if you're getting any information from Alexander Graham Bell associated companies, you'll find that they prefer oralism. So they prefer for deafness to be cured. Whereas you're going to find many hearing aid and assistive devices companies pushing their product. So we're almost done. Let's talk about social work ethics and core values. And we'll take questions. Thank you. Okay, here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, comments, experiences, stories, etc.
I had a quick comment.
Okay.
I noticed that with everybody wearing masks, that a lot of people didn't realize that they couldn't hear until someone was wearing a mask and they couldn't read their lips. So there's like a lot of newly aware people with hearing loss.
You're absolutely right. I can't tell you how many people have come up to me and said, I really have a newfound appreciation for what you live through every day. And so on and so forth. So yeah, this is really open. I think the thing is that the pandemic allowed us to no longer sweep it under the rug. Now it's becoming more obvious and talked about, maybe becoming more obvious, and it's impacting more people. Anything else?
There were some other questions that came up in the chat. One was, are there proposals currently to allow Medicare to pay for hearing aids?
None that I'm aware of. I know of
my sister, can I break in here? I'm sorry. My sister receives Medicaid. They are paying for her to, she has a case manager, that's the thing, and it depends on which kind you have, whether it's Unicare or the other, I think. I'm not sure on that part. But they're going to buy her a set of teeth. I'm thinking that if you have a Medicaid card and you qualify with a case manager, you might be able to get them. I mean, what's it going to hurt?
It's possible. You can always ask, but the state of West Virginia doesn't require it for people in between the ages of 18 and 65.
And West Virginia does not, I mean, this is Helen Snyder, and I just have left the region. Medicaid pays for under 18 both cochlear implants and hearing aids. Cochlear America is their single vendor. Medicare does not pay However, some of the Advantage plans, they contract with hearing aid companies, and just like they do vision, and will pay for certain devices or pay a portion of certain devices. But it depends on the plan selected and the premium that you've chosen. But if you're straight Medicare, they don't pay for anything.
Yes.
Good questions.
So another,
Medicare will pay for hearing aids if you are blind.
That's
Yeah.
good to know.
The only difference I can figure out what's going on with my sister is she's got a Medicaid case manager. And that case manager somehow got that to go through. I don't know.
Okay,
It may have been, she's right, if there's other disabilities along with it, they will, certain programs will. I know under that ABD, that for blind, you can get hearing aids and other assistive communication devices under the ABD waiver, but it's limited. So she may have qualified under, there's a lot of waivers too, type things that certain people can qualify.
Another question on the hearing aid topic is, do you know what the cost range for decent hearing aids would be?
When I got my last set last year, I decided to go with like the highest grade model ever. Because I learned that this model would actually reduce the amount of wind sound that travels through my hearing aid, and wind really impacts my ability to walk safely on the streets. So when it's windy, I can't hear at all. But with these special hearing aids, I can hear some. So I paid $5,000 for these.
Sarah, I have a tip for you.
Yeah.
I work with blind people who have to hear in order to cross streets, and many of them wear hearing aids. I discovered that if I got a lady's headband, which is just a very thin strip of fabric, and put it directly over the hearing aid, it would cut the wind and they could hear through them. So you might.
Does the air still breathe through the hearing aid and prevent it from whistling?
Yes.
Cool. I'll give it a shot. Thanks.
Okay.
Another question is, did you teach your 3-year-old to sign?
Yes. She was resistant, but yes, I taught her.
And the last question we had come up in the chat is, it's a comment and then a question, is I've noticed that those who interpret using ASL often exaggerate their facial expressions. Do those with impaired hearing or deaf appreciate this? Or is this something that a hearing person assumes is appreciated?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say from my perspective, yes, it helps add to the emphasis. So that's the thing. Like, as you see, I'm relatively dramatic. Part of that is hearing loss, and part of that's my personality. Those of you who know me, you know me. But yes, the added emphasis really help to tell us, illustrate the story.
I know that was my favorite part when I was working as an interpreter, was interpreting music. Like I would be a rock star on The Voice if they allowed that. I mean, seriously. So it's really fun to put that kind of expression and stuff into what you're interpreting.
Absolutely. Well, oh, it's only that. Okay, so we finished early. All right, let's talk about social work ethics.
I have one question. I am visually impaired, and I'm always very nervous when I encounter someone with a hearing because I can't see what they're writing. And so is there anything like as a person visually impaired when trying to like communicate with somebody hearing that I can do? Usually I try to like touch my eyes and let them know I can't see so that maybe they know I'm not able to see their signing, but how do you kind of deal with that?
Wow. That's a tremendous question. Usually I pair pretty well with people who have vision deficits because they are my ears and I am their eyes. Even though I do wear contacts and I'm farsighted in one eye, nearsighted in the other, and have astigmatism. But
I've got a tip for that too.
Okay, the thing I would like to say is that Sarah Morgan probably can answer that question better than I can, but every person that I've encountered that is someone with hearing loss, even within the deaf culture and the big D deaf, they are so patient because they just want to be heard. They just want to be included. They don't want to feel isolated. And so anybody who even attempts to learn how to sign or takes the time to slow down and take into consideration the deaf person's needs or the person with hearing loss, their needs, they are so appreciative. So even just recognizing the difference and knowing that there may be some limitations because of the communication differences, recognizing that, honoring it, saying it out loud, calling the white elephant in the room, whatever, what have you.
Sarah?
Yes.
So one way that technology can help with that is with texting. So if the person can text her and she has a phone that is, reading the text to her, I assume she probably has that capability on her iPhone and she probably uses that. If the person can text her, she can hear the message and then she can talk the message back to that person and that person can read it.
Yeah, and that's what I do. I think the hardest thing for me is where I don't realize that they don't hear until I kind of keep talking and then notice that I'm not really getting a response. And then you see what I'm saying? You see, yeah. So that's kind of how I've had to, like, I got to realize that I'm in front of someone who's not hearing me. But I have the same thing. People think I can see because I'm looking dead at them, but I'm not seeing them at all. So,
yeah,
and they'll be talking and I don't know they're talking to me because I've learned not to respond just because someone said something, because I've responded thinking people are talking to me and they're not. So it's just kind of trying to figure out immediately that this is someone who may have a hearing loss.
Right.
So another thing you can do is always have a white cane with you, even if you don't feel like you need a white cane in order to navigate efficiently and effectively. You can get what's called an identity cane, which is just basically a white cane that's smaller and easier to carry around. And it still identifies you as a blind person so that other people understand that they need to accommodate to whether they're deaf or even if they're not deaf, they understand that you're not seeing as well as other people.
Where do you get that at? I've never heard of that.
So the National Federation of the Blind is an organization that you can get a free regular white cane from. All you have to do is go to their website, nfb.org, and you can order a free white cane. All you have to do is give them your name and address and how tall you are, and they'll.
Yeah, I knew that. I mean, the identified, the small one. I've never knew that they had those.
They have those too. You just have to go to their marketplace website, nfb.org, and get that. You have to pay for those, but the regular white canes are their white canes are much lighter than those fold up ones, and they're fiberglass, and plus they're free. You can't beat that. So you might talk to somebody at rehab center for the blind and vision impaired, whatever state you're in, and talk to an orientation and mobility instructor, and they would get you that. They would
Okay.
get you either an ID cane, they would evaluate you if you needed an ID cane, or if they thought you needed a regular cane, and would give you a lesson in how to use it.
Okay, thank you. And this was a great presentation.
Thank you. I do want to add a short story before we talk about ethics or before we go on to more questions. I noticed probably exactly 10 years ago that, well, I've tried to integrate myself into the hearing world, that I never really have taken much into consideration with regard to my hearing loss and how it impacts my mental health. So about 10 years ago, I recognized, hey, I might be grieving the fact that I don't fit in this world. I don't really fit in the deaf culture. I don't really fit in the hearing world. I don't really fit in anywhere. So I called my mother-in-law and cried to her for a little bit, because she works as a vocational counselor for the federal government. And she was very supportive and encouraged me to reach out to my voc rehab counselor. And so I called my voc rehab counselor that day, and I explained to her that I recognize that my hearing loss may be contributing to some mental health issues, and that I felt like I needed to grieve the loss of, or the inability to fit in with society in the way that I wanted to. And my voc rehab counselor said in response to me, well, I can't introduce you to any of these deaf people. You know, there's HIPAA laws and stuff. And I said back to her, well, I don't need to be connected with other deaf people. I want to talk to a professional. And she said, what? Well, we do have deaf groups, but they're not going to accept you in their group because you live in the hearing world. And I said, well, that's not really what I'm looking for either. And he said, I would like to talk to maybe like a therapist who has experience in working with hearing loss and grief. And my voc rehab counselor actually laughed at me and told me there was nothing like that existed. And, you know, basically, good luck to you. So at that point, I remember exactly where I was. I had decided that it might be that I would have to be one of the first ones to do that. But I'm finding with the more research that I do, since it hasn't been done before, it's going to be really hard to do that, just because of all the language barriers and issues with language deprivation, and being able to provide services. However, I am making myself open to working with people with hearing loss, as someone who can empathize and relate to those who are also struggling with the integration in the hearing world. So hopefully in my therapeutic practice and as I pursue my LICSW, that will be something that I can do more of in the future. Are there any more questions?
I have to say something else. Sorry, Sarah.
Sure, yeah, sure.
I'm happy to yield if anyone else wants to say anything. You know, there's a huge parallel to what you're saying about your personal experience to the blindness community as well. You know, there's a lot of people that have low vision that don't fit into what they call the blindness community or the sighted world. And so it's a whole group of people that are just in your very exact situation, just a different sensory impairment. So, you know, I've talked to, you know, dozens of people about that very thing, and with them, it all boils down to what I call owning the blindness, not being ashamed of it, not trying to hide it, not trying to act like you don't have a vision loss. That's why I'm a big proponent of carrying a white cane, even though you don't feel like you need it to get around. That you're not trying to hide your blindness. You're putting it right out there. This is who I am. And I think in a way, it's true for people in your situation as well, because you're not trying to hide your hearing aids. You don't mind saying, I'm sure you don't, hey, I can't hear you. I need to see your face or whatever. You're speaking up. You're not trying to hide it. And I think it all, when they say there's nobody counseling, that's just adjustment to disability, and it's about, a neighbor of mine has Bell's palsy. She would go around with her hair hanging down in her face to hide her face. It looked terrible. It looked way worse than her face being down on one side. My goodness, cut your hair, hold your head high, own it. It's not that bad. And you know what? A couple weeks later, she actually did cut her hair. Her whole family was shocked. It's like, I actually kind of got mad at her one time because she was over here for dinner. And I compared it to blindness. I said, people would come around, they didn't want to use a white cane. Oh my God, I don't want people to think I'm blind. I'm not blind, I can see. Well, not really. What are you doing here? At the rehab center, right? Why are you here if you can see? You can't, yeah, it's somewhere in the middle, but own it, Well, it's easier for you to say you're not blind. Well, I'm not blind, but I've got other stuff going on, it might not be blindness, but I've got a thing, So everybody has a thing. And if you own it, if you step up out there with it, it's, you take away the power of other people to use it against you, And I think that's really important. You're not ashamed of it. You're not trying to hide it. I always tell a story about two old ladies. Okay. They both had vision loss. One of them didn't want other people to know she couldn't see. So she stopped going to church. Her world got smaller and smaller. She had to go everywhere holding her husband's hand. And she, didn't want people, God forbid anyone thinks she's blind. Right. Well, the other one got a white cane, went out to the store, held her cane up in the middle of traffic, stopped traffic, went across the street, got her groceries, went to the bank, did everything, went to church. Everybody said, oh, now I know why you didn't recognize me. You can't see. And now I know to come up to you at church and talk to you. So these two old ladies had the exact same disability, but they handled it completely differently. One of them got on with her life and lived her life the way she wanted to live it, the way she always had. Going to the store, going to church, doing the things she wanted to do. And the other one's world got smaller and smaller, and she got bitter and she got controlling, and her family started to resent her. And who do you want to be? Which old lady do you want to be? Right? And it doesn't just apply to blindness. It's any disability. It's how your attitude is about it. What is your attitude about your disability? So
I have something I want to add to that, and then I want to let Nick speak because he's so politely raised his hand.
I will mute myself.
No, you're fine, Sarah. I just wanted to say that I've had numerous people over the years who have said, Sarah, you just need to put a sign on, you need to wear a t-shirt that tells everybody. And I've even looked at Amazon to see what they're offering nowadays. And there's big old stickers you can put on the back of your car. But the thing is that also makes me a target. That also tells everybody around me, hey, I'm deaf. You can take advantage of me. You can come up behind me and grab my hair and shove me in a car, and I would never see you. I would never know you were there. So I agree with you on the idea, because I feel more empowered than I've ever felt in my entire life being able to talk about it. The last 2 years at the social work conference have been the first times I've ever spoken publicly about life with hearing loss. On the flip side, I feel like there's a level of dangerousness with going around and really advertising where you have loss and where you can be taken advantage of, how you are vulnerable. So I think it really has to depend on the comfort level of the person who is living with the loss and having to determine what they're okay with. And quite frankly, I'm not okay with announcing to everybody in the world. I'm okay with telling every single person that I talk to one-on-one. I'm okay with talking to everybody who comes into my workplace. But if it comes to the people on the streets, or it comes to walking down in the mall, if it comes to somewhere else, I am not going to publicly announce where I am vulnerable.
Okay, so I have to answer that too. So this is a huge thing that comes up with blind people not wanting to use a white cane for the very thing that you're saying. I don't want to announce to the world that I'm weak or that I'm vulnerable. Okay. But, and you know, blindness is different from deafness. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but we have that conversation about, you know, which would you rather do? Stay home and not use a white cane and never go anywhere, or put yourself out there and behave in a way that you are confident? Walk with confidence. There's a certain way that you can walk with a white cane that shows that you know what you're doing. If you're tentative and scared and have your head down and act like a victim, then you're gonna be one. But if you hold your head up and you walk with confidence with that white cane, and you cross streets by yourself and you put yourself out there, nobody is going to mess with you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
now,
you.
I'm not saying you should wear a shirt that says, "Hey, I'm deaf." I mean, I don't know. But what I'm saying is the white cane is a symbol, not of disability, but of independence.
Okay. I like that.
And so that becomes a very powerful thing for white cane users, that concept, when they come to that, because it doesn't happen overnight, getting to that thought. You know, most people started out not wanting to use it because it's a symbol, they believe it to be a symbol of disability.
No doubt.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. We have a couple more questions, and Nick did raise his hand.
Yeah.
So Nick, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to share a quick story on an experience of working with a client in the deaf community. And I just wanted to point out that something we may want to consider, and maybe a good class for what was just communicated, that we may or may not be experiencing a privilege in our ability to be visible or not visible in certain communities. And there may be a space for people who have to worry about their safety over their ability to have confidence or positive experiences. As we saw in this training, a lot of the experiences in a hearing community in the deaf experience often is not a positive or at times safe. So I had raised my hand before that came up. I'm gonna stop on that.
Thank you. I appreciate what you have to add. I agree. You know, it's a complex world we live in.
I'm a practitioner. I do private practice in the Eastern Panhandle, and I was approached by an individual who participated in the deaf community and identifies in it. And if I was in another practice, I think what would usually happen is people would try to refer them out to somebody who has the skills. And instead of doing something like that, I actually researched and found a company in Wisconsin that does remote video interpreting. And so we use the cost that comes from the reimbursement of the insurance. You know, it's the reimbursement's important, because how often would this person they actually reached out for services? I can't imagine a person doing that. And we actually had really good success. We were able to help meet a lot of their solutions. They were able to talk natively in the language they felt comfortable in. And there, of course, were times where the individual interpreting, because we're in Wisconsin, they would take a second or two to be able to figure out what's the context that we got each other, because there's differences in that context. And what was fantastic was I was able to talk with them, looking at them in their eyes and being able to make contact, seeing facial expressions, and not have to worry about writing things down or passing things forward. And we actually were able to have some really good, deep, organic conversations that I think would have been lost without that ability for them to speak in their own language and not have to accommodate my needs as a hearing person. So I did put that link in the chat box.
Thank you.
But I think
would you mind to email it to me too?
Yeah.
Yay, thank you. I'm excited. Thank you for your input.
Tammy Rizzio had a question about a teenage daughter. Do you want to ask it, Tammy?
I will try to. My internet is not cooperating very well this evening. So I have a friend whose teenage daughter is quickly losing her hearing due to a medical condition. I have gotten them connected with our local Centers for Disabilities, and I'm hopeful that that will help things. But the teenage girl, I really think it comes back to grieving her loss. She's expressing a lot of depression. They've talked with her about the cochlear implants, and she's super resistant. Just wasn't sure if there were any other resources. She is involved in therapy, and I think that's going as well as it can right now, but I didn't know if there were any other resources that I could provide to this family.
What part of the state do they live in?
We are in the like Elkins area, so like kind of central West Virginia.
Yeah. There are some there are some deaf communities of relatively significant size in the Clarksburg area and in Huntington. And then obviously in the Romney area. What I wonder is if maybe someone who knows her can reach out to the Board of Education to talk to the people who specialize in working with hearing loss and see if they can send a teacher out to her school and get her connected with other kids who have hearing loss that are local. It is going to be imperative, especially if she's got something like Meniere's disease or something where she will eventually lose her hearing. It will be imperative for her to start working on integrating and building relationship with other people that she can feel similar to.
Great feedback. She so far has shown a lot of depression, and I think you touched on it earlier in your presentation that isolation feels very comfortable. She has not been very open so far to discussing sign language and things like that. So I'm really hopeful that getting her connected with other folks could help a little bit with that.
There are also Facebook groups. I wonder if she would want to be added to a Facebook group of people with hearing loss and be able to express some of her feelings there if she should choose to do so.
I think that's a great suggestion too. I mean, she's a teenager, so she really always has her phone in her hand. So
right.
I hope it's okay. I took a screenshot
well, I like them too.
Slide so that I can send it to her mom. So
Certainly.
She can have your contact information.
Absolutely.
Faith, did you have any other questions for Sarah?
Apparently finding a mute button. No, I didn't see any others in the chat. So, but I definitely want to make sure I write down your email so we can kind of connect and stuff like that. So
I love texting too. So if you guys want to send me an email with your phone number, we can text. We didn't really get to talk much about ethics, but hopefully you guys noticed throughout the session where ethics, issues related to ethics could obviously be important to note, and how
I think you were raising a lot of ethical issues throughout the whole context of everything.
Thank you. I thought so.
No, I think you
I
did.
appreciate the validation.
Yes. So we're at a little bit after 7:30, and thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great job, and a lesson for all of us to learn. Lots of questions. I even have questions about my own hearing after this. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Tomorrow morning we start at 9 o'clock with Bill Lepp, the liar. The Appalachian Storyteller. It starts at 9. So our final plenary session. So thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Sarah, with the email, I also wanted to send you, because with your story, there's a counseling center that actually just opened up in the kind of DC metropolitan area that caters to doing therapy in sign language and in other resources. So I can send that to you as well.
Oh, cool. Thank you.
I could pop in the chat, but there are 50 people left. I didn't want to have a whole bombardment.
Right. I hear you. Well, my chat box says 99 plus, and it'll probably take me a couple hours to sort through it.
I just want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I've been listening to you on my cell phone because I was having trouble with my computer. But as the aunt of a hearing niece who is a teacher of the deaf and also an interpreter in New Mexico, married to a man who has been totally deaf since he was 2 years old. And it's interesting, when they married 20 plus years ago, she said to me, 90% of a hearing and 90% of couples, one of whom is hearing and one of whom is not, divorce.
Wow.
And I see it as a real testimony to how hard they've both worked. Her husband did have speech up until the age of 2, and then he was deaf, and he was ignored by his family, who also never learned American Sign Language. He's a counselor for the deaf, by the way. They've got a wonderful life in New Mexico. But this was eye-opening for me, even after all these years. So I appreciate it. And the other strong memory I have is almost 50 years ago, when I was a young practitioner. I went to do a consult on somebody in the hospital who was deaf, and we had an interpreter who was interpreting him to me because he signed. But he got furious, picked up a chair and threw it at her because he believed she did not interpret well and was miscommunicating his feelings. It was a very, he just said, she doesn't know what she's doing. She doesn't know how to sign, It was just an experience I remember, because I thought, how often we don't know the other side of the story for someone else. Anyway, thank you for letting me go on and on. I just really, really appreciated your comments today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your beautiful input. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.